Can you unpack their relationship and kind of how they were trafficking, how they would find people and how they would traffic the victims, the actual mechanics of what it is they were doing?
What happened was Maxwell set up this machine, and she recruited, there were a number of procurers, and they recruited girls. I mean, that was a huge machine that Maxwell set up that was solely designed to procure underage girls. And there were a number of procurers. The New York Times, in addition to naming Ghislaine Maxwell, named 5 or 6 other procurers. And the amazing thing about the Maxwell trial is she was indicted on one count of child trafficking. Child trafficking carries a 15-year to life sentence. And she was indicted on one count. And the other procurers that we know about, that the New York Times wrote about, they weren't even indicted. Now, if we were really seeking justice in the Epstein case, what would happen was we would take the procurers, like the FBI or the Department of Justice dismantled the mafia. We would indict those procurers on multiple counts of child trafficking, where they'd be looking at 10 or 15 or 20 years in prison, because they certainly trafficked a lot of girls. And then they would roll over on the perps. If there was actual justice going on here, that's what would happen. But yeah, Maxwell set up this machine, and she conscripted other procurers, and they conscripted other procurers, and it was like a huge vacuum cleaner to find Jeffrey Epstein and his perverted pals, underage girls.
I mean, it's kind of a gross way to think about it, but if you had to put a ratio between Jeffrey and Ghislaine, is it Ghislaine or Ghislaine? Ghislaine. What would you put the ratio as far as the power of that network, the control of the network? Was it 50-50? Was Epstein more in charge of connecting the people that she found with those that were looking for that particular type of whatever you want to call it?
Maxwell was his number one lieutenant.
Okay.
Basically.
So do you think he was largely pulling the strings as far as the direction that they were trying to go, or do you think they did it more collaboratively?
Well, Maxwell oversaw the machine.
Mm-hmm.
And Epstein provided these girls to the power brokers that he provided them to. And then Maxwell took part in that too. I mean, she was also complicit. But it was Epstein that was primarily pandering these girls to the power brokers.
So he created the body, and she fulfilled the role of the skeleton to make sure that it had the legs.
Yes. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on I mean, probably the most recognizable thing I think the average person on the street would recognize from the Epstein story is the island. What are your thoughts on the island, the flight logs, and even I had heard recently, I might be butchering this a little bit, but didn't recently a senator block the subpoena for the flight logs to the island?
Yes. Well, the island is where a lot of that, I mean, the island was lawless. Epstein could do whatever he wanted at that island. He was the president of that island, essentially. There was Marsha Blackburn, a Republican senator, sought the flight logs of Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I've got flight logs. I've got flight logs from 1998 to 2006, and they certainly demonstrate a lot of names. But Marsha Blackburn wanted to subpoena the flight logs. But what happened there was the Democrats were going after the Supreme Court justices, especially Clarence Thomas, for his moral turpitude. And Blackburn was actually, it was kind of a quid pro quo, where if you're going to go after these conservative justices, I'm going to subpoena these flight logs. So basically what they were doing was, and ultimately the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was controlled by the Democrats, knocked down the subpoena, quashed the subpoena. But it's politicizing child abuse. I mean,
Yeah.
she should have been asking to subpoena those flight logs because it was the right thing to do, not because the Democrats were going after a pervert like Clarence Thomas, who is very much a pervert and most likely compromised.
Do you believe that Epstein, I'm trying to think of the correct word to, I guess organization, Epstein's influence, does it touch equally both sides of the political aisle?
Mostly, I would say the Democrats, but the Franklin scandal, the book that I wrote about the trafficking network, it was primarily little boys that were pandered to Republicans, and Epstein was pandering little girls to Democrats. That seems, unfortunately, to be the partisan divide amongst our politicians.
So another thing with the island and a lot of the other properties was the hidden cameras.
Yes.
And obviously those cameras were there for recording, and I'm sure a multi-hour conversation could go, was it for the personal use of the people involved in those acts? Was it for blackmail? Was it for both of those things? Everything in between. Where do you think those recordings are now is the more interesting question to me.
Well, the FBI, when Epstein was arrested this last time, the FBI drilled his safe, and there were, depending upon the source, hundreds to thousands of DVDs. And some of them had names like Little Redacted plus Redacted. So there were probably there was probably a lot of compromised footage there, and probably child pornography too. So the FBI impounded everything, and it's gone into a black hole. I did a Freedom of Information Act request. I did not ask for the DVDs. I asked for reports on the DVDs. And as soon as Epstein killed himself, the federal government declared that the case was closed. So I felt, well, if the case is closed, I can, submit these Freedom of Information Act requests. So I submitted my Freedom of Information Act requests, and I was told that the case was ongoing.
Interesting.
So as Americans, we're going to have to press for that documentation to be revealed.